My name is Gal Peleglaniado. I'm the Vice President of Engagement from J Street. Before we start, a couple of technological notes to share. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, so you can ask your panelists questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Today's discussion will be recorded and available to rewatch and share on J Street's YouTube channel, and you can find the link in the chat. Now, I hope I speak on behalf of all of us that we share in overwhelming relief that this nightmare is coming to a close. For the hostages, their loved ones desperately awaiting their return after months of protesting, and for Palestinian families in Gaza who have endured the unimaginable. It's been a painful road to get there. We fought, every one of us, for moments like this for well over a year. And we, of course, with that, this journey had been much faster. We hope that this journey had been much faster and relief could have come much sooner for those in Israel and Gaza. We know that there's plenty of work ahead of us to ensure this deal sticks, to ensure extremists don't spoil something good, to ensure the horrors of October 7th and the past year never happen again. We're lucky to be joined by two Middle East policy experts today who, just like us, have been waiting for this moment and knee-deep, if not neck-deep, on these issues since October 7th. They'll help us unpack the intricacies of the deal, what led to this moment, and where we go from here. So I'll start with Ilan Goldenberg, who is a foreign policy and national security expert with 2 decades of experience advising American leaders on the Middle East, US-Israel relations, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Iran. During the October 7th attacks and Gaza war, he served as special advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris on the Middle East. Subsequently, he became the National Director for Jewish Outreach on Harris' 2024 presidential campaign. Ilan previously served at the State Department as part of the small negotiation team supporting Secretary of State John Kerry's initiative to conduct permanent status peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, and has also worked at the Pentagon and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Born in Jerusalem, Ilan moved to the United States at age 8. Celine Touboul is co-executive director of the Economic Cooperation Foundation, ECF. She leads ECF's policy efforts related to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, as well as ECF's work on Gaza-related issues. Celine is also a member of Forum Deborah, an Israeli forum working to enhance the role of women in foreign policy and national security, a member of the Geneva Initiative Board, and a member of the Commanders for Israel Security Working Group on Gaza. Celine worked at the NATO Defense College and Israel's Ministry of Justice. Let me start by saying that first, thank you so much for being with us, and the well-being of the hostages has been top priority for J Street and certainly in the hearts and minds of the Israeli public. We're anxiously awaiting to learn about their health and conditions. Celine, I wanna start with you, if that's okay. Rewinding to yesterday, what was the immediate reaction to the deal from on the ground? And if you can elaborate on what has happened in the past 24 hours since both parties agreed to these terms.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me today. I think that there is a general sense of relief and hope, relief that the hostage will return home and that the war is coming to an end. But there is a lot of anxiety also, because it is clear that some of the hostage will not come back alive, and that many are expected to learn upon their return that members of their families and friends have been killed. So the trauma of the war will not end with their return. And in that sense, I think it is far from being a happy ending. In the last 24 hours, I mean, that anxiety kind of raised because basically until the last minute, until we see the cabinet convening in Israel and authorizing the deal, there is still a kind of, uncertainty that the government will ultimately come to terms. We have seen a lot of pushback, primarily from Bezalel Smotrich, threatening to quit the government, or requiring from the prime minister to put in writing a commitment that the war will resume after the second phase. So now basically he has announced that he's supporting the first phase. And I think we are all aware that indeed until the entire deal is implemented, there is a lot of uncertainty in regard to whether we will ultimately reach that second phase. So I think this is where we stand today. And but I have to say that this is the first time, I think, for the last year that I'm a bit optimistic that we will see hostages coming back next week.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely share that optimism, and you mentioned the phases. So if I can stay with you with just another minute, could you walk us through the phases as you understand them?
Sure. Well, first, it's important to understand that the proposal is based on the proposal that was made on May 27. And it includes two phases, as I mentioned. The first phase is to be implemented over 6 weeks and includes the release of 33 hostages, and in exchange, the release of 1,000 of detainees that have not been involved in the October 7 massacre, and hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. It is unclear how many of the hostages, as also I mentioned, are alive, even though the Israeli assessment is that a majority is. Negotiation over the terms of the second study to start 16 days after the beginning of the first phase, and we'll focus on the exact numbers and categories of prisoners to be released in the second phase, as well as on post-Gaza governance and security arrangements. The key element of the deal is that it includes the gradual but ultimately full withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza, except for a security perimeter along the fence between Gaza and Israel, the reopening of Rafah crossing under specific condition that the Egyptians have demanded, the return of displaced Palestinians to their original areas of residence, and a commitment to significantly increase the flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza. It also includes a commitment for a permanent ceasefire, and that has been one of the most contentious issues. But again, at the end of the second phase, and this is the point that is directly challenged by Bezalel Smotrich, as I mentioned. Now, the key question, and I'm sure we will discuss it later, that remain unsolved and will be key if we ultimately want to avoid Hamas to rebuild its capacity and the war to resume, is what will be the security mechanism in place and who will govern Gaza. And a failure to define this arrangement will very much undermine the viability of that ceasefire.
Thank you. So, Ilan, I want to turn to you, and for what Celine laid out, if you can elaborate on what were the sticking points for the parties. I know Celine mentioned a few, and I'm curious if you could shed some light on the likelihood that the tough issues will be worked on in the next 6 weeks, so a permanent ceasefire can actually be achieved.
Sure. And first I should say thank you, Gal and J Street, for having me. And also just express my own relief and optimism for where things are going now. And to say, I work, both for Vice President Harris and for President Biden on these issues. And I know that they care very, very, very deeply about this and have. I've worked really hard for it. So even though I'm not in the administration anymore, just, trying to at least say I just expressing that view of theirs that I know is true and held as well. And the amount of times that they and everybody at the White House spent with the hostage families, and dealing with the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and trying to address this. In terms of like where things go from here and the hardest issues, there's almost like two separate categories. I think there's the immediate, things like prisoners and assistance getting in. And I think you can expect a lot of hiccups, a lot of challenges like what we're seeing today in the press, misunderstanding over details that will just have to be worked through in sort of real time with the mediators. It was painful. We just had an experience of doing this for a week last November, and it was challenging and kind of touch and go every day, like who's going to come out, when are they going to come out? Is Israel meeting its requirements on assistance? Even if the aid is getting in, if the infrastructure isn't there to support it, or if a bunch of it is getting siphoned off because of lawlessness in Gaza and it isn't getting to the people who need it, does that matter? In terms of politically, does that put pressure on Hamas to walk back? The timelines along when precisely Israel moves out of where, and if those are being met, there will be just so many hiccups, not to mention, and you can't tell exactly what's happening today. I think part of it is probably genuine, expected kind of hiccups and technical negotiations and disagreement. And part of it is the politics, as Celine mentioned, with Smotrich in particular threatening to bolt the government. I think people expect there's a good chance Ben-Gvir might, but people were like not as expectant of Smotrich also, which is a different scenario and potentially brings down the government. Right. And so like all of that is going to continue to fester and just make this very challenging. But the good news is I think the parties are far enough ahead into it and invested enough in it and feeling enough pressure both from the outside and from the inside from their populations that I think all these things are surmountable. And I'm optimistic that the deal will continue to go through. I mean, the bigger question on long term, right? And can you get to this phase two? I see three scenarios there. I think one scenario is you actually get to an agreement on post-conflict Gaza. I'm very skeptical that's going to happen. Because that requires, really it requires some steps that I just don't believe this Israeli government is going to be able to take that ultimately start pushing you towards a two-state solution or at least a reunification of Gaza and the West Bank. Not immediately, but over time, that would collapse the government. The other is everything breaks down. I'm optimistic that's not the outcome because I think, again, there'll be a lot of pressure to kind of, bring, to everybody wants this to end. Nobody wants to restart. And so I think the most likely scenario is the parties kind of paper over the arrangements in post-conflict Gaza to a point where enough aid is going in that Hamas sustains the deal and the hostages come out. But like we're not left with, like we still have Hamas in Gaza in some form or another, a weakened Hamas in Gaza, and like we really don't, and still have a lot of Palestinian suffering and no real meaningful way forward. I'm worried that's the most likely outcome. It's better than what we have today, but it's not great.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I want to take a step back and lift up something that I also see on the Q&A, which is that the deal on the table is essentially the same as the one laid out by President Biden in May. With the final agreement now made, this revelation is particularly frustrating. So for both of you, I'm curious, and some of the people who joined us curious as well, why did it take additional 8 months to get to this point?
Celine, I don't know if you want to go first or if you want me to hop in. All right. So look, obviously, I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated that it took 15 months, period. Right? Like, I wish we could have gotten this done a lot earlier. I think so many of us do. That being said, I don't think saying, well, the deal is what was proposed in May, I don't feel like that's a real measure because, first of all, that was only an outline. It didn't include all of the details, and the details matter to a great degree. Second, the situation has fundamentally changed since, when Israel proposed it, and then President put it on the table publicly. Hamas initially rejected it. We got the entire world to kind of come out in support of it. Hamas calculated that it was isolated, and therefore, like it was smart for it to come to basically like back off and agree to the framework. At the same time, Hamas was still calculating that like it could trigger a regional war that would force Israel to come back with better terms. Netanyahu still had the political situation at home where, Ben Gvir could single-handedly essentially bring down the government. Like all these different factors were out there. And, Sinwar wasn't dead. Like, you had the war with Hezbollah hadn't happened yet. So I think a lot of things changed, right? In the situation, both domestically, politically in Israel with Gidon Sar coming in and bringing a few seats with him so that now Netanyahu, I think, thinks he can lose Ben Gvir but not Smotrich with this deal and maintain the coalition. We'll see if that actually happens. And he's also, dramatically weakened Hezbollah. I think far exceeded expectations, frankly, exceeded the expectations that we in the US government had about like what that war would look like, but also I think exceeded the expectations of what the Israeli government thought would happen. And in doing that, really set back Iran in the region, with everything that has happened. I think it's really weakened Hezbollah's hand or Hamas's hand, and also brought them back to a more reasonable place in the negotiations, realizing we can't trigger a regional conflict. So it is super frustrating that it's taken so long. I really wish I had taken less time, but I think it is these outside factors, both in Israeli domestic politics, the regional situation, that have changed the calculus of both actors and kind of brought them together.
Thank you. Thanks, Ilan. Celine, I'll turn to you in a second. And on the American side of the negotiations, we understand that Biden and Trump administration actually worked in coordination on this issue. So, Celine, how much of a role do you believe Trump's election win play in getting Netanyahu and Hamas to this point?
I think we can make two observations on that. First, that there is a first assumption that the combination of Trump's determination to see a deal on hostage release materializing before entering office, together with Netanyahu's desire to start on the right foot with the Trump administration, did play a key role in bringing Netanyahu to accept a deal that he refused initially 8 months before. His attempt to add new demands, including last week, was ultimately pushed back, and Trump's team was unequivocal that a refusal to reach a deal will have repercussions. And this threat, in my view, contrasted with the reluctance of the Biden's administration to openly blame Israel for the lack of progress, which I think enables the Israeli government to avoid paying a political price for the ongoing stalemate and undermine the Israeli public pressure in favor of a deal which a majority of Israelis supported. I'm not saying that if he would have made that blame public, it would have changed everything, but it will have changed the dynamics inside Israel when it comes to the perception of why there is not a deal. Another observation I think we could make, generally speaking, is that the cooperation between the Biden and Trump team, I think, is a demonstration of how bipartisanship is important and can make US engagement more impactful vis-a-vis Israel, and that it strengthens the ability of the US to lead policy change. And in that sense, I think it was a very much welcome cooperation that brought results on that issue.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And Ilan, I'm turning to you. And what can you tell us about the negotiating strategies of a Trump administration versus a Biden administration?
Well, look, I mean, I think you needed kind of both approaches. Like Celine said, I think it worked pretty well together. The fact that Biden really wanted to not have this still going when he left, and Trump really wanted it over before he started, was incredibly valuable. And every sense I have gotten is that the teams worked really well together. I'm not sure if Biden had come out and publicly, he didn't do as much blaming of Israel. Although there were moments, for example, when he actually like withheld arms, which I don't think the Trump guys would have done. So I'm not sure if coming out and doing the public blame game would have necessarily gotten a deal earlier. I think part of the challenge is that like Netanyahu's base in particular and who the people he cares about, because he cares about his voters, like have a much higher opinion of Donald Trump and always have, and like aligned with the Republican Party. And so politically for Netanyahu, a public break with Donald Trump is a major problem. Um, politically for Netanyahu, a public break with Joe Biden is like much less of a problem. Like that's the reality. So I think Trump had more leverage in terms of, um, support with the Israeli public. Like Trump had more leverage with Netanyahu with the constituency that mattered, except for the first few months of the war when Joe Biden was incredibly popular in Israel after he came, in the days after the start of the war. And in those days, when he had that leverage, we managed to get a deal that got 100 people out. So, I think that like that's like a big difference. But I think as time went on, and frankly, I think that Netanyahu like was very happy to, as Jack Lew said in an interview with Times of Israel like earlier this week, like the Netanyahu government was happy to inflate differences between Biden and Netanyahu and make it appear like the gaps were bigger than they were, because I think it actually removed the fair dose of leverage that the U.S. had as he tried to like knock down Biden's popularity in Israel. And so I think that is part of what was going on and part of the contrast. But, at the end of the day, I do think you need both, and I hope that it's true for the execution of this too. I would hope that at least some of the professionals who have worked on negotiating this for the past 15 months for the Biden administration are held over for at least a few weeks in the beginning, like for the details. Because it's good that when Trump comes out and says like there will be hell to pay, like that's a good thing. That was helpful. No, but I don't think anybody, but also you need to have the patience and the understanding and the depth of like being able to negotiate some of these brutally hard details. And like that's gonna, as we talked about, if you don't have that, like this thing you're gonna need that on a day by day basis. You're gonna need the mediators to be dogging both sides to make sure this is actually executed and dealing with all the inevitable flare-ups that are gonna come. So I would say you kind of need both some Biden and some Trump to make this work.
Thank you. And I want to stay with you with another question from the Q&A from Phyllis Snyder. How many other countries were involved in developing this agreement? Has there been any commitment to a day after planning?
So look, the main characters, the main players, are Qatar and Egypt, along with the U.S. and Israel and Hamas. And Egypt and Qatar played invaluable role, like throughout, and will continue to. At different moments, you also needed to apply broader international pressure, right? We got a UN Security Council resolution supporting the proposal in May, when we had all the Arab foreign ministers coming out in support of the proposal in May, right? Like we did all these things right after the agreement. And I think they set in place a framework, that even though it took 8 months afterwards, the fact that the whole world was behind it kind of made it the default framework we were always going to end up with for the deal, and so like I think that like international like coalition and pressure like helped in that way, and an agreement both on both sides. And then yeah, I mean look, there's been a lot of talk a day after and some conversations, but it's very, very hard, especially as I mentioned before, with an Israeli government that, anything that like will really work for the Arab states and that will bring in, I think, big international support has to include some vision of a day after that ultimately gets to a two-state solution. And even if that's like down the road and not immediate, in some ways off, but ultimately has a pathway that involves the Palestinian Authority taking a leadership role in Gaza. Like, these are all things that are anathema to the current Israeli government. And so without that, I just don't know how you're going to get to a major reconstruction plan. I mean, we have to keep trying. But I should say, I'm being like, now that I'm outside of government, I can sit here and be an analyst and opine, but I also spent, a lot of time thinking about these issues inside of government, knowing how hard they were. And yet, like, you got to keep going because the alternative is worse.
Thank you. And speaking of, internal pressures on government and intra-Israeli politics, Celine, another question from the chat was, what impact would Ben Gvir and Smotrich exit have on Netanyahu, and especially on his willingness to commit to the ceasefire?
I think it can the threat that they are likely to put on Netanyahu not to move towards the second phase is likely to impact him and to find, ways to delay. And the question will be, I will guess, what type of pressure he will face from the Trump administration. I think he's very eager to have a good relationship with President Trump. It's important for his legitimacy, for its political legitimacy, to make the point that, he is not the problem, because basically having a bad relationship both with Biden and with Trump will kind of demonstrate the case that this is not the US administration that is responsible and guilty for the lack of progress, lack of support, the failure to, the Israeli failure in that war. And so, he will have to find the right balance. I'm also not totally convinced that, but that's another question, because it's a question of perception from Netanyahu's perspective, but that Smotrich will materialize his threat. I think he has much more to lose to quit the coalition than to stay in the coalition. But again, doesn't mean that Netanyahu will be convinced that he will not materialize it. So that's a different question. But so I expect the pressure to continue. And maybe to also get off that pressure, he will try to strike a deal, like, you support the deal, you don't put me in a uncomfortable position with the Trump administration, and I will secure the administration's support for moving towards the next section in the West Bank. And I expect him to try to make this kind of trade-off.
Thank you. I now would like to just enlarge the circle a little bit, and it also came out in few of the topics in the Q&A. So the regional circumstances have dramatically shifted since October 7th. Israel has decisively weakened Hezbollah and Iran, and Assad, one of the regime's top allies, has fallen. So Celine, staying with you, can you talk a bit about the role Israel's military success might have played in reaching this moment? Would we be here today without them?
Well, I would agree with something that Ilan said earlier, that it is clear that Hamas has aspired to trigger a regional multi-front war against Israel, to bring both Hezbollah and Iran to launch a massive attack on Israel. And Israel was indeed under fire from Gaza, from the north, from Iran, but not to the extent that Hamas hoped, as none of the Israel existential infrastructure, water, electricity were damaged. But to say that, in my view, that the weakening of Hezbollah following the Beeper attacks and killing of Nasrallah and the regime change in Syria is what has made the deal feasible, in my view, is ignoring the fact that this deal is the same as the one that was on the table in May 27. So maybe this is what has brought Hamas to agree 8 months ago to make concession. But I'm not sure that this is what explained that delay. In my view, it is more related to Netanyahu's reluctance to clash with his coalition, and which has led him to put again and again new conditions for a deal. When it comes to the weakening of Hamas, most of the military gains against the military wing have been made months ago, and the sense in recent weeks is actually that Hamas is managing to regain a level of control over areas in Gaza, primarily because since October 7, and we spoke about it, no alternative Palestinian governing entity has been formed, and Israel has consistently vetoed the possibility for the PA to play a role in Gaza or of any government structure to be planned and discussed within the Israeli security establishment.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Can I just hop in on this call? The one point I think, and I agree with almost everything Celine said, but the one point like I just have a different view on is like, look, like Hamas did agree to like the structure of the deal in, you know, in I think it's actually about 5 weeks after like the administration initially put it on the table. It was early July. But then the numbers of prisoners and things like that and all the details that they were putting on the table were completely like unrealistic and often in crazy land, frankly, like were never realistic and got only more and more extreme as it looked like there might be a war in Lebanon. And then only after I think Israel decisively defeated like Hezbollah, and frankly, a result that was better than anything, like I said, anything we expected, anything the Israelis expected, certainly anything like Hamas expected. And then you had a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, like that fundamentally changed Hamas's calculus. And so you can say there was a framework for an agreement in early July, but if the framework involved like X thousand numbers of prisoners and Israel was never going to go there, that's not a deal. That is a framework. And it was the fundamentally like the strengthening of Israel's position that brought those numbers down. And so, like, was this partially about Netanyahu and his reluctance to do a deal? Like, 100%. Like, it was absolutely like, you know, was him playing politics and was a shift in his internal dynamic? Like, yes, that was definitely it. Was it also about Hamas's numbers being like completely unrealistic and out of whack, and then not really wanting a deal because they thought like they could get a better deal at like if there was a war between Israel and Hezbollah and that would put more pressure on Israel? Also true. So like, you know, there's been a lot of debate about who is responsible. I mean, who is responsible for dragging out this negotiation? And I think the dissatisfying answer, and one that is pretty common actually when you have two parties very far apart negotiating like that, in my opinion, is like both. You know, and so like that's at least my take on it. Which, by the way, I should say is very different than who's responsible for all this in the first place, which is like, you know, Hamas, who actually kidnapped and took all these people hostage, just to be 100% clear, and triggered this whole conflict, or at least this latest round of conflict starting in October.
Thank you. No, thanks for that, Ilan. And I want to start shifting to moving us forward. And as Jay Street stated yesterday, and as we've advocated for over a year, diplomacy cannot stop at the ceasefire. We are encouraging world leaders, including the incoming administration, to leverage this success into a comprehensive regional deal with all Arab League states plus Israel. Or as Jeremy coined it, a 23-state solution, with that 23rd state being Palestine. So Ilan, I have a two-part question for you. The first is, what are the chances of the Trump administration to continue its diplomacy with the Middle East and with the Netanyahu government? And the second part, which also comes up pretty strongly also in the Q&A, is about humanitarian aid. Trump himself has a history of cutting aid to Palestinians. Now they need it more than ever, especially in Gaza. Can we expect him to actually provide what families need from the United States?
Well, actually, I'll start with the second half first. I'm very worried about that, because we've had such devastation in Gaza. And, foreign aid is exactly something that's popular with Donald Trump. I mean, if you're cynical, like you can just say he wanted to get the deal done under Biden's watch, so this just isn't a story for him, and we don't have to invest anything. I mean, and if that's like where we are, then I think there's just so much to be done, and there's so much that needs to be invested just to bring Gaza back to where it was, you know, before the war. And where it was before the war was still very far from where it needs to actually be. I remember, writing a long report on Gaza 6 years ago, and how we looked at, and Celine, you and I worked on a lot of those things together, long before this. And it was just, the level of water, the level of food, the level of infrastructure, power, all that before the war was a huge problem. And so, yeah, I'm really worried about that. I think Trump will be fascinated with, Israel-Saudi normalization and want to do that. I can see him thinking he can get it without making progress on the Palestinian issue. I think I'm personally very skeptical that he can. I think that like Palestinian peace needs to be part of any normalization play. It's really important. And I think as Secretary Blinken has said, like it's crazy doing like literally on October 6th, doing meetings on just those issues and thinking through just that piece. So I think if he tries to do it without the Palestinian piece, he will run into a lot of challenges. And then the question will be, what does he do then? Who does he apply pressure on then? What does he prioritize? Does he just say no worries? Does he just really try to apply pressure on the Saudis, or does he try to apply pressure on Netanyahu? Like, I don't know. I don't know. We'll have to see what the Trump administration does and what he personally does in that kind of scenario.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Celine, I have a two-part question for you too. Um, is there an appetite among both Israeli leadership and the public for a comprehensive normalization deal that promises Palestinian statehood? And also, sticking with the issue of humanitarian aid, obviously the Gaza Strip is in dire need for that. What are your thoughts on the feasibility of a surge of humanitarian aid in light of very troubling legislation that we see both in Israel and in the US that are blocking UNRWA specifically?
Okay. So first, normalization and statehood. No doubt that there is a huge appetite in Israel for regional normalization, but definitely not for Palestinian statehood. Palestinian statehood is viewed today in Israel as a major risk and as totally irrelevant in the context of the October 7 trauma. Still, it doesn't mean that, I really don't mean to say that the Israeli public and part of the Israeli political leadership, I think a majority of the Israeli political leadership in Israel will oppose normalization if it was conditioned by a shift of policy in the territories and gradual progress toward a two-state reality. I think that the majority of Israelis will favor normalization over annexation, as it was the case in 2020, and are likely, therefore, also to support a security-based shift of policy that move away from settlement expansion, from annexation, and choose instead a gradual path toward a two-state outcome that contribute to stability and security, with strong reassurance in that context, and enable a separation between Israel and the Palestinians. And I think that the combined effect of Trump's popularity in Israel and Israeli desire for normalization and regional integration could grant support for such a shift of policy, but it will have to be marketed, as something that is also mindful of Israel's security interest and so forth. When it comes to the humanitarian response, I think that the key challenge in that respect is the chaotic situation that we are seeing in the Gaza Strip, the total lack of law and order, the rise of criminality, the looting, that has, made it impossible to secure distribution of aid. Obviously, there is not contradictory to the fact that there is a need to increase the quantity, but increasing the quantity will not in itself solve that problem. And therefore, I think that we cannot go away from dealing with the issue of governance, of empowering a Palestinian entity that will address the need of the population, that will receive the support from a third party to kind of compensate maybe for the lack of Palestinian Authority capacity when it comes to security force and police. So you need these arrangements also to boost the humanitarian response. And I think it's impossible to separate the two. So I'm not sure that the key problem here is legislation against UNRWA. I think that the main problem with that legislation is elsewhere. I think they have managed to work with WFP and other organizations. Doesn't mean that UNRWA is not needed in Gaza, but I think that the key problem is elsewhere.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And many people who are involved or engaged with J Street are closely following the political implications, both in Israel and the United States. So Celine, I want to continue with you, and I'm curious both about the fallout for Netanyahu and his coalition, and I'm going to add to that a question from Alan Kotok in the Q&A. What role can the Israeli opposition parties play in the way forward? Can they exert any leverage or pressure to keep the deal implemented? Oh, you're muted.
So first, as I mentioned before, I don't expect Smotrich and Ben-Gvir to leave the government over this deal. Definitely not the first phase. But again, they will continue to exert pressure for resumption of the war, and most particularly push back against any attempt to enable any arrangement that will enable the PA a foothold in Gaza to be a relevant and legitimate player for them. PA is a bigger threat than Hamas itself, because it's a kind of the embryo toward the Palestinian state. And their priority is to do everything to prevent Palestinian statehood. Now, without this arrangement, regional states will not agree to contribute to Gaza stabilization. We won't have a durable ceasefire. Hamas will continue to rebuild itself, to regain control of Gaza, and it's just a question of time until we will come back to the endless kind of cycle, the confrontation between Gaza and Israel. And as Ilan mentioned, it's an issue on which we have been working for 2 decades, I think, basically since the disagreement. It's not something that we have raising as a key problem from October 7. And needless to say that under this circumstance, we also won't see any viable reconstruction process in Gaza. So a shift of coalition is ultimately required. Now, the opposition in Israel, first they should prepare themselves for the possibility that there will be a reshuffle in government if Netanyahu makes a decision that that he will, choose normalization and a good relationship with the region and over this current coalition. But they should be prepared to make tough demands. Maybe the same way that Smotrich did when he enters a coalition. And these demands should have things to do with no annexation, and what does that mean? And what does that mean to move toward normalization? What does that require, and what they are willing to do in that context? So I would hope that they will, be more ready in regard to what they demand, the kind of structural change, also that they will demand in the defense establishment, because Smotrich, part of this change that he has made that made annexation moving forward is, also, but I'm not going to enter into these kind of details, but has a lot to do about the whole structure of how the defense establishment work in the territory and deal with settlements expansion. And I think that they will be ready to support a deal from outside the government. And ultimately, we should not exclude the possibility that there will be elections. And again, if there is election, I think their program and their response to this challenge regarding Gaza, and you cannot deal with Gaza without dealing with the West Bank, will be more articulated.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Ilan, there is a little bit of a sense of deja vu from the Iran hostage crisis. And so I'm curious what in terms of the timing, and I'm curious what might these deals say for the legacy of the Biden administration and the start of the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different than the Iran hostage deal in that like it was actively being bipartisan like cooperation to make the deal happen before the end, right? It wasn't the Iranians holding and then just giving it to Reagan. It was much more of like a concerted effort over the past like couple of months, really, like really since the election, pretty quickly. You had engagement between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, like the incoming Trump team on this. And you had a pretty cooperative relationship from the start. So, I think, like I don't think that like that will be the echo. I mean, there will be debates aplenty about like who is responsible for, for the hostage deal. In the end of the war, and I think my view is there was a cooperation between both sides that like ultimately did it. And that frankly, at the end of the day, what mattered a lot more was the other things that we're talking about, the fundamental change in the circumstances of both parties, combined with like the pressure Trump was bringing to bear, combined with all the work that Biden had done to set the conditions and the table to get the deal done in the first place. And so that's how I see it. I mean, I think the broader question of legacy, I think in this war is one, I want to take a little more time to think about before I say anything. I've been out of government for about 2 months, and I think that one takes I think there needs to be some soul searching and pondering done for sure. I think a lot of things were outside of the administration's control and events unfolded. But who knows? Like, I think there's also things that obviously could have been done differently. But it's maybe at some point I'll talk about that.
Thank you. And we'll love to have you on one of those opportunities to talk. I want to head back to Gaza, Celine, and a question from Amy Perlmutter. Is it your assessment that Hamas has been weakened or grown as a result of this war? And what comes next after Hamas?
Well, Hamas military capacities, as well as its governmental structure, have been largely destroyed as part of the war. But the hard and difficult truth is that Hamas, as a Palestinian political force, which is a different question, is not going anywhere. I don't think it has necessarily been strengthened as a result of the war. Definitely not in Gaza. I think the sentiment in Gaza is not pro-Hamas. But in the West Bank, that's a different story, also because of the weakness and lack of legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority. Now, I think that the objective should be to neutralize Hamas' ability to destabilize the region and threaten Israel's security. And doing so required to empower Palestinian moderate force, those that have refused to use violence as a political tool to achieve their national aspiration. And so it requires a policy that rewards non-violence. And the PA is definitely an imperfect partner. It is weak, corrupted, it lacks internal legitimacy. And so there is a need for reforms, no doubt about that, but also a political process that lead to Palestinian statehood and that empower a leadership to make these reforms in a way that will not antagonize part of its own constituency. So I think it goes hand by hand. It doesn't mean that doing so will make Hamas disappear, but it will also empower the PA ability and security capacity to contain them. And we cannot ask at the same time for the PA to be strong and fight terrorism without giving them the ability to do so.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to hop in and echo Celine's point on this. I really feel like, this is part of a lot of the work that I did when I was back in government, was like really planning for the day after and what that looks like. And you can't, and this goes back, frankly, like I see a lot of what the Israeli military strategy in Gaza has been not all that dissimilar to like where we were in Iraq in like 2003 and 2004. You go and you destroy things and you take out the bad guys, but you can't beat something with nothing. And the refusal, you have, I think on the security side, and the security professionals understand it. And like, when Gantz and Gallant were in the government, they understood it. And this was one of the biggest disagreements they had with Netanyahu, is like, you've got to start planning for this, and you've got to like put in place a real alternative, like in real time, and that's the lessons that we've learned. And they haven't done it. And given the nature of this Israeli government and the politics, like this coalition is never going to do it, as Celine outlined. And so Hamas might be weak now, but like there's going to be perpetual insurgency there, or perpetual Hamas control, unless you have just a whole fundamental shift in attitude by the Israeli government. And at the end of the day, like, pre-October 7th, the entire strategy was, keep Hamas in place and keep, like the West Bank and Gaza separated, because there's no chance for a two-state solution in that world, and keep them weak and placated, and thought they had it managed and obviously didn't. But I mean, there's a world, like, I still, sadly, it's not the world I want. It's not the world I'm going to advocate for. It's not the world we should all be working towards. But I think there's a very high likelihood that when this is all said and done, and we're looking at this 2 or 3 years from now, like we're back in literally the exact same place, except that, the situation for Palestinians in Gaza is much, much worse than it was before. And obviously, but other than that, it's still basically all the same, which is an incredibly depressing thing to say.
Yeah, and just to avoid that, that little bit of a bitter end or bitter trajectory that you laid out, I wanna actually ask you the last question before I ask you both for closing remarks, that Ethan McMahon brings back home. And the question is, what can the American public do to ensure that this deal is fully implemented? Is it a matter of pressuring the United States executive and legislative branches? Please give us a little bit of a lift there.
Sure. Well, I think first it's, overwhelming support for the agreement that was, because I should say, even though like, I paint a very negative potential picture of where this all goes in the long term, like the most important thing in the immediate is still, getting the hostages out and ending the war. Like, because none of that like changes any of the long term, like it only makes it worse. So, advocating and saying thank you to and giving credit to both, the Biden administration and the Trump administration, or the incoming Trump administration is a good thing, and that's like worth doing, and it's worth the American public doing. And then advocating very hard for pressing the parties on a real plan for Gaza. I do think if you advocate for one thing, it's, in terms of Gaza in particular, it's assistance for Gaza, like not forgetting about what's happened, but also governance, as Celine talked about, and like pushing to keep this on the agenda. Because there's a world where like when the war's over, it's like, all right, time to just put this intractable thing aside. And that's from an American perspective, what I would argue for.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you both for not just for a very thoughtful conversation, but also for all that you are doing and advocating to bring us to this moment. And I just want to leave you, I'm looking at the time and I see that we are close to the hour. And I just want to give you an opportunity to share with us any closing remarks from your end.
I just want to echo what Ilan just said, that whatever reservation and doubt that we have for the future, the announcement yesterday evening of a deal is extremely overwhelming, and it whatever we want for the future, that's a start. That's a starting point. We cannot do anything if we don't have that. We cannot have normalization. We cannot have statehood. We cannot have anything. We have to start by that. So it doesn't mean that the policy efforts end there. It definitely not the whole story. But without that, we are not able to build anything.
Yeah, and I'll just echo Celine's point and say that like we spent a lot of time on this call talking about the things that aren't going to happen or are so challenging. But at the end of the day, like yesterday was like a fantastic day. It's the beginning. It's going to be a very hairy few weeks and months, but it was really like, like despite some of the negativity sometimes that comes out of my mouth on this phone call, on this Zoom, like as an analyst from a pure like human perspective, it was really just like a wonderful day and the culmination of like something people have been working very hard for and a lot of people have been praying for a long time. So
thank you. So thank you for that, and thank you both, and thank you everyone for joining us for this, and fingers crossed that we'll pass through all of those hurdles and we'll see this agreement comes to fruition. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.